This is the Education Exchange with Paul Peterson. I am the senior editor at Education Next. Thank you for joining us. The current Minnesota controversy over misuse of federal grants for child care and other social services raises large questions about the ways in which federal dollars are handled at the state level. One of the issues out there is whether or not state agencies are stealing money from orphans in order to pad their own budgets. To discuss this topic, I have with me on the Education Exchange Emily Putnam-Hornstein, a professor at the University of North Carolina School of Social Work in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Thank you, Emily, for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Terrific to be here.
Now, you have a very interesting essay in which you say that Health and Human Services Secretary Robert Kennedy has charged state welfare agencies for stacking the deck against children. One of the aides at the HHS says the agency is seeking to curb abusive practices that are being used to steal from orphans. Now, that sounds terrible, but is it really? What is the issue here? What is the problem of state agencies using a child's Social Security for its own costs?
Yeah, so of course, I'm sure your audience, as you mentioned, is quite familiar with all of the allegations of fraud right now that are coming out across the country. It was very interesting to me to see that HHS and ACF, which stands for the Administration for Children and Families, and oversees state child welfare agencies, was also including the use of Social Security benefits as a type of fraud. And so let me just kind of at a very basic level explain the issue at hand. The Social Security Administration administers two types of beneficiary programs that will go to children. One is Social Security income for highly disabled children to kind of help parents cover the cost of their care and treatment. And then the other is a Social Security survivor benefit, so that when a child has a deceased parent, there are dollars that can offset and defray some of those the costs of their continued care. When a child is eligible for those benefits, the parents will typically become the representative payee, and the Social Security Administration has very specific rules about how those dollars are to be used.
So ordinarily, that money just goes to the parent of the disabled child. So if a disabled child is eligible for supplemental security income, that means they're a very low income, which a lot of disabled people are, then the money goes to the person who's taking care of that child, which in the best of all circumstances is the child's parents and maybe a guardian if that's not possible.
That's exactly right. So the question then and of course, as you pointed out, the dollars are not set up to be a trust fund or a means of building assets for the child. It is to be used for the child's current care and maintenance. So the question is, what happens when a child enters the foster care system? And most children who enter the foster care system enter due to abuse or neglect that they have experienced. When they enter the foster care system, the state, with some federal support, covers the cost of their everyday food, kind of foster care placements, therapy, whatever they need.
Well, can't that also be used if they're so disabled that they have to be placed in a residential setting? So it wouldn't necessarily have to be foster care, or what's the situation there?
I mean, our essay in the City Journal was really focused on child welfare and foster care agencies, and when they become the enter foster care. But you're exactly right that, of course, there are other situations where the state agency is assuming some care for an individual who might have significant disabilities, and they become the representative payee or receive some of those dollars to offset the costs of care.
Well, if the foster care parent is, if the child's in foster care and there's a guardian, why wouldn't they be the representative payee? Wouldn't that just be obvious?
Well, the Social Security Administration looks to see who's available to serve as the representative payee. And certainly, if a child is placed with a legal guardian, a grandmother, they can become the representative payee. Many children who enter foster care do not have an extended, stable family network who would be in a position to serve in that role, which is one of the reasons they're entering foster care. And I do think that for reasons of fraud and accountability, foster parents are effectively employees of the state agency. They are working on behalf of an agency, they have to be licensed. And so the payments that they receive may come through with some of those Social Security dollars attached to them. But I do, historically, it has been the state agency that becomes the representative payee and is in charge of managing those dollars towards the care and maintenance of children.
So why is Kennedy questioning this? Are there groups out there who are saying this is somehow inappropriate?
Um, there are many groups out there who are saying that this is inappropriate. One of the things I find most interesting about child welfare are all of the strange political bedfellows that form. So this particular topic, you've got everybody from the America First, what is it called? The America First Policy Institute. It's kind of very, yes, on the right, to, the Marshall Project and NPR. Basically using very, very emotional language. You led with, we're now calling it an orphan tax. There have been accusations of confiscating these dollars, stealing from orphans, intercepting the funds. And the truth is, because Social Security is a very complicated program, and the public understandably does not understand exactly how these programs are supposed to work or
I
be
always feel like the
administered.
disabled are the easiest people to prey upon because they cannot respond. They cannot articulate well in their own defense. And whenever you can't speak for yourself, you get all kinds of, what shall I say, birds of prey circulating around, trying to make a name for themselves under those circumstances. Do you find that to be the case?
Well, I would certainly add another group to that, which would be vulnerable children who have been abused and neglected, no longer have their parents in a role of advocacy and care, and are placed in foster care involved with the child welfare system. So I think that that would be another group, and I definitely think that is true.
So you're saying that this is so Kennedy is being influenced or pressured by both the right and the left on this one. It's not like this is a right-wing campaign or a left-wing campaign, but just sort of a, well, I call it a media campaign. People who want to get in the media.
Yeah, I think it's a very simple narrative that tugs on the heartstrings of your everyday American, because what a terrible thing to think about big bad government agencies stealing from vulnerable children. But the reality is, states are not stealing from children in foster care. And advocates who are pushing this agenda, they're trying to make it an inflammatory story. They're appealing to the emotion and a poorly informed public. But the reality is, under law and under regulation, what states are doing is perfectly legal. And I would argue that we are setting ourselves up for much greater fraud if we attempt to make it difficult for state child welfare agencies to become the representative payees.
Well, you say it's according to law, but what's the evidence that it's according to law? Have the courts commented on this question? Are there any rulings that are relevant?
So 20 years ago, and I should, I am not a lawyer, so this is my understanding. I'm also not an expert in kind of Social Security Administration and benefits. My area of expertise is in child welfare, but 20 years ago, this went to the Supreme Court because the state of Washington was serving as a representative payee. And the court ruled that as long as the state was acting is as kind of federal guidance required of all representative payees and being a kind of a good fiduciary steward of those dollars while children were in foster care, that was totally legal and appropriate. My understanding is it was a narrow ruling. It didn't weigh in on all sorts of other questions that might surface around representative payees. But truly, when a kid is in foster care, the state is serving as their parent. And Paul, you would never see a situation where we're saying that a widowed mother who is using Social Security survivor benefits to pay rent is doing something inappropriate with those dollars. She is paying rent because she is caring for her child, and those are some of the costs that she incurs with that care.
Well, I'm assuming that the state costs are quite in excess of SSI. SSI payments are usually rather modest, and the cost of foster care has to be very substantial. Once the state assumes that responsibility, it's going to be costing the state a pretty uh, substantial sum of money, is my guess, and therefore what they're retrieving from the portion of the SSI that they claim, that's probably just not much, not much towards the total. Am I right in that?
I think that is very fair. And I will also say that while there have been fairly outlandish allegations that are being made, I have yet to see any specific examples or evidence of a state using dollars in ways that are not related or inappropriate and not serving the best interests of those children.
Well,
So
can you give me an anecdote? Do they have any anecdotes that the
oh,
critics that
sure. I mean, there was a committee hearing a few years ago where Elizabeth Warren, let me just see if I can get the exact language, but basically she kind of alleged that states were intercepting these benefits of orphans and disabled children in foster care, putting them in a state general fund, and then using them for everything from paper clips to prisons. Now, first of all, if that is true, then the Social Security Administration should take whatever steps are necessary to curb that practice. But the reality is, what happens is sometimes when dollars flow, they are initially put into a state general fund before they are allocated to the specific agency. And again, state agencies are required to comply with all of the same kind of rules and regulations as a kind of a parent representative payee. And so if there's fraud, that should be dealt with. But there have never been any specifics that I have seen put forward that would justify those allegations. And I have asked colleagues, I'm like, have people come to you with specific examples of state X did the following? And I have, again, people cannot come up with anything. And so what we can agree on is if states in their role as representative payees are misusing the funds, then that should be dealt with. But you will note that the letter that went out to the 39 states and all of this rhetoric, we seem to just be kind of bullying states into you should make these changes because we're going to call you really mean names. And we think that this is a moral issue that you are taking the funds. There are no specific allegations.
Well, what is it? You mentioned a letter that was sent to the 39 states. What was the letter? What did the letter actually say to states that they needed to do?
So I have not seen a copy of the letter, but there have been a few different kind of interviews and others, kind of other communications around the letter. And as I understand it, the HHS and ACF are basically telling states that they are going to start with honey but they're happy to use vinegar because for them this is a moral issue and that states need to change their practices and policies so that they are no longer taking and using these funds.
Well, let me shift a bit here and ask you about this issue as it connects to the homeschooling community, because one of the allegations that are frequently made about the homeschooling practice is that it is being used by foster parents in ways that are utterly inappropriate, and that there's a lot of child abuse that's occurring in that space. Have you taken a look at the connection between homeschooling and child abuse, which is regularly claimed to be, the two go hand in hand?
I have, and I know that this is a very fraught topic. I will start by saying that I have five children, and I homeschooled two of my children for 2 years, and it was a great experience. And so, you are not talking to someone who is not very supportive of homeschooling for parents who would like to choose that educational option for their children. I also believe, however, that there should very reasonably be some basic rules um, established that would help to reduce the risk of child abuse and neglect for children who are being homeschooled. And I have been frankly surprised at how difficult it has been for states to even and legislators to even have some of those conversations. And when I say basic rules, I'm not talking about we're going to send child protection out to every home where there are children being homeschooled to do a body check once a year. What I am talking about are situations where we have repeated reports and allegations of abuse and neglect, and the parent chooses to pull that child out of school, notionally to homeschool them. The child is completely off the radar, and there is quite literally nothing that can be done. And there is no adult surveillance that allows for any understanding of what's happening to that child. And Paul, you talked about disabled children, where I see that a lot in child welfare, are when you have significantly disabled children who are at home with very questionable caretakers, and where, frankly, there is abuse, neglect, torture, whatever you want to call it.
So, how is this a prevalent situation across the states, or is this concentrated in certain parts of the United States? What's the distribution of legislation with respect to the kind of surveillance that homeschooling can be subjected to?
So first of all, on the kind of the prevalence of just, or the incident, there's really no good data. So I would be kind of just speculating as to the numbers. And the reason that there's no good data is that that is viewed as a form of state surveillance. I can tell you that I homeschooled in North Carolina, and it simply required that my husband and I fill out a form. We opened a homeschool. There was never any kind of check. There was no background check. There was no criminal check. There was no confirmation that our kids hadn't been reported for abuse or neglect. I tried to gather some data in California where we had registered homeschools and child welfare reports to try to cross-reference those. But because the data that is even collected for homeschools is so minimal, there was no ability to even look at that empirically to see or to answer a basic question, which is how often do we see children reported for abuse or neglect who suddenly move from a public schooling environment to a homeschool environment, which again, some people might say, well, those families were being harassed, the school was unnecessarily calling things in. I don't think that happens very often. But while I can't off the top of my head tell you here's what every state is or is not doing, I published a paper a year or two ago, I'm happy to send it to you, where we did do a scan of states. And I can say that The Homeschool Legal Defense Fund has been, or Homeschool Legal Defense Association has been quite quite effective at making sure that that those protections don't occur.
Well, then now the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund will argue on the other side that, well, we have to protect homeschooling parents because many states are trying to impose all kinds of regulations on parents that really don't make any sense, and that they really harass parents unless they're defended by the agency. So, how do you respond to their concerns?
I'm not unsympathetic to those concerns. I do think that there is a the media has kind of picked up on a narrative that suggests child protection and child welfare agencies are kind of going after parents for free range parenting, for homeschooling, for other things. I think that those are anecdotes that are very, very rare, few and far between. And so, what I would say to any listeners who also support homeschooling, as I truly do, is that I think there must be some way that we can come up with some very basic protections that would not infringe on parental rights, and yet would help to guard against some of the really egregious situations that I'm sure you've seen that hit the media. And I just, to me, it's kind of unconscionable that we won't at least try to figure out something that both sides would feel comfortable with.
Well, that seems like a very balanced and reasonable way of approaching an issue that is, once again, more heat than light in most conversations. So, thank you, Emily, for joining me on the Education Exchange.
Thanks so much for the conversation today.
I have been speaking with Emily Putnam-Hornstein. She's a professor at the University of Carolina, North Carolina, in the School of Social Work, and she is also closely associated with the work of the American Enterprise Institute. I am Paul Peterson. This is the Education Exchange. Please join me for our new Education Exchange podcast, released on the Education Next website every Monday at noon Eastern Time.